And welcome everyone to our 40th Inspiration Exchange. We're super excited today to be talking about a super hot topic in machine learning of digital twins. So just some housekeeping before we get in. So the Schaar Lab is currently recruiting for PhD students for the upcoming 2025 year. So these are 5 fully funded PhD positions. We encourage you to take a look at the website. We're looking forward to receiving many interesting applications. And then before getting in, we just want to highlight our last session of 2024, which will be on the 3rd of December, which will cover machine learning evaluation and testing and deployment. And then today's session, which will be covering digital twins, which will be led by Tennison Liu and Sam Holt, 2 PhD students in the lab, will cover their recent NeurIPS 2024 paper, which is the spotlight. We encourage you to post questions in the Slack. I'll be posting that in the chat. Before handing over to Tennison and Sam, I'll hand over to Mihaela. And then we're delighted today to also be in part 2 joined by 4 amazing industry panelists for a roundtable and QA about the implications of digital twins across medicine and biopharma. I'll introduce them more formally when we get to the panel in part 2. So I'll hand over to you, Mihaela, to kick us off.
So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on this session on digital twins. I'm especially excited about it because I think digital twins are an unbelievably empowering technology for a variety of areas, but also complex, cutting edge and challenging new area of machine learning. I'm going to start prior to Tennison and Sam telling you about our recent work to frame the problem of digital twins. I'm going to talk briefly about what digital twins are, why do we care about them, and why I believe that machine learning can transform this technology. Okay, so what are digital twins? A digital twin is nothing else than a dynamic virtual representation of a real physical system. And just to anchor some ideas, we can think in medicines of digital twins of an individual, a patient, for instance, or a digital twin of a biological entity, for instance, an organ, or why not a digital twin of an entire healthcare system, or a digital twin of a clinical trial. These are 4 examples, but there are many more in medicine. We can also think about digital twins in other fields, education, finance, organizations, and cities. So please keep whatever example is most pertinent to you in your mind during this presentation. So how it is really built? A digital twin uses real-time data and whatever knowledge we may have, mechanistic, physiological, etc., and machine learning to mirror and simulate how the real world would behave. So for instance, we may want to understand how, given a particular patient, past history, how will this person behave in the future? And also how it will respond to a variety of interventions. We will also want to know what will happen if this patient experiences a particular event at a particular moment in time. How will this patient evolve into the future? And you see here a graphic from a recent NPG digital medicine paper with the physical entity, which is a real person, on the basis of which a lot of measurements from microscopic to macroscopic are taken, and how the digital twin of this individual can be used to do a variety of things, from understanding treatment strategies all the way to unrolling the futures of these individuals and being able to do early detection and intervention. So some of the core components for this are data collection and integrations from a variety of data sources. And what's interesting here is that while the data that we may have available may come from offline sources, we also have the opportunity to integrate real-time information about the individual. And a key point here will be that we want to make digital twins of a particular individual, whether it's a person or a company or a healthcare system. So personalization is key to this endeavor. Also, we need simulation models, and here is where machine learning generative models are going to be very powerful, and they need to be combined with whatever other knowledge we have, whether it's physiological or physics or pharmacological or financial if we are in another setting, to unroll these possible futures, to be able to understand all the possible realistic futures for this individual entity. And because we have at times real world and real-time data, we may also need continuous synchronization between whatever digital entity is forecasting and foreseeing and the real measurements we are making to, on the real individual to calibrate this digital twin and to keep it consistent with the real physical entity. At this point, I'd like to pause and say, we are talking here about digital twins requiring generative models rather than predictive models. We don't have digital twins to make predictions. For that, we already have fantastic machine learning methods that can forecast what will happen to an individual over time, or if we are interested in interventions, methods such as causal effect inference that will tell us what will be the effect of a given intervention. In the digital twin case, we want to generate what are the realistic possible scenarios for this individual. So hence, we are focusing on the unsupervised setting of generative models, and the focus is really to sample feature instance from a density estimate. And this is, again, quite different than what we do when we are doing prediction or discriminative modeling. Digital twin is inherently a generative modeling problem. Another thing I'd like to ask you is, why do we really care? And for that, I'm going to start first quite high level and say, in many industries, for instance, as shown in here, the aviation industry, we are not sending something as complex as a plane into the real world without testing it very thoroughly within a wind tunnel. We do that because we want to understand how well this particular device works. We want to test hypotheses. We want to also be able to timely and correctly intervene before really taking this product into the real world. Note, though, that the wind tunnel is not aware of all the intricacies and particularities of the plane. It is just emulating, simulating a realistic environment. Similarly, a digital twin has a similar role. It is not that we have embedded all the possible rules of simulation. There are many things that we don't know, and yet we need to use data to be able to simulate this environment, to understand, test hypotheses, and timely and correctly intervene. So we need digital twins, for instance, in the case of medicine, to be able to think and do scenario planning as well as test hypotheses prior to really intervening on these systems that are both complex and may require safety considerations. At the practical level, if we are able to do that, digital twins can enable us to improve personalized medicine, predictive analytics, operational efficiency, as well as accelerated innovation. And these are just some of many other impacts we can have. And in terms of more quantifiable benefits, we are going to be able to much better do both cost saving as well as enhance accessibility. But let me return to the machine learning question, because many of you are machine learners. What is really the interesting machine learning question here? Machine learning models, generative models, which can simulate realistic data and trajectories, as well as outcomes given different types of interventions. This is what we would like to achieve here. And we would like to do that together with validation and uncertainty quantification. We do not want to envision digital twins of particular individuals that don't make sense, or that or for which we do not have measures of uncertainty associated with the generation. We want to know what we do know to generate correctly and what we don't know. So at this stage, you may wonder, given the fact that our lab has really pioneered this area of synthetic data, you may wonder, are digital twins synthetic data? And already I see in the literature some people equating the two. But the two technologies are really sharing some similarities, but also have differences. So are digital twins just synthetic data? No. While there are similarities in the fact that they are both simulating and representing real-world data, and they both may have privacy and accessibility constraints, if you like, and they are all used to support decision-making, there are key differences. First, digital twins are focusing on the individual. We create a digital twin of a specific individual, given their unique characteristics. While synthetic data creates a synthetic data version of a real data set. It doesn't focus on an individual. Also, in synthetic data, we are focusing on static or at least generated at once data. While in the digital twin, we may have the ability to continuously gather additional information about the individual, which will help us with future generation. Also, what is very important is to be able to deal and model interventions. In synthetic data, we are emulating whatever exists in the data set with or without interventions. While here in the digital twin, we need to anticipate different types of interventions, and we really need to think about and generate what would be possible outcomes given entire sequences of interventions into the future. This is when digital twins become really important, and this may not be available in the data set at hand. So that being said, I do believe that synthetic data can support the technology of digital twins because we can use synthetic data to train digital twins when we have limited real data. And also it can be privacy enhancing. A lot of the technologies that we have developed for synthetic data privacy preservation can be imported here. And this will also enable us to test with synthetic data to preserve privacy. Now, I also talk about interventions, and this may lead you believe that there is also a link to causality, and that is correct. Both causality and digital twins aim to support intervention and determine what will be the outcomes of interventions. And also, they are both aiming at understanding dynamical systems and providing insights into them. But while causality is focusing on estimating the cause-effect, in digital twins, we are focusing on the real-time simulation aspect, given interventions. Also, the data requirements are different. In the causality setting, we are only for observational data, while in the digital twin, we may enhance that with real-time data acquired from the entity. So there is also complementarity here because I do believe that embedding causal knowledge in digital twins can significantly improve the performance of digital twins. And conversely, I believe that digital twins can empower causality because it enables us to test causal hypotheses in a controlled and virtual environment. So there is an interesting symbiosis, not only with synthetic data, but also with the world of causality. That being said, I asked ChatGPT to describe the complementarity between causality and digital twins, and you can see that it is not able to create a coherent picture. So there is some work to be done for us, the machine learners. The biggest challenge I think we need to address with digital twin, it is very much a reality-centric agenda. And for the ones among you who are newer to our sessions, we have on our website this manifesto, which we wrote a few years back, which I invite all of which is the case for reality-centric AI. It is prominently displayed on our website. And I think pillar one of the reality-centric agenda is very pertinent in the digital twin agenda because we need to create models in a systematic way to identify how to model the world. So if it is to create a digital twin of the individual, what characteristics of this individual need to be modeled, and at what level of fidelity for what particular question? So it could be that if we want to understand the comorbidities of this particular individual, we need to model certain parts of the digital twin correctly, while if we want to determine how to intervene in a case of a patient with cancer, other types of characteristics of the digital twin become pertinent. So a challenge is even deciding what type of data to incorporate to make the digital twin useful for a purpose or a set of purposes. And here I outlined quite a few challenges at the lower level that range from model generalization to data scarcity to making these models interpretable and explainable, because in the end, digital twins need to be acted on by humans, to ways to realistically test these virtual environments, but also personalization and adaptability, handling uncertainty, because we need to know when this digital twin can be trusted or not, simulation accuracy and fidelity. And also, as systems become more complex, if I'm interested in an entire human body, which is an interaction between these different organs, or a healthcare system which has numerous components, the modeling of such more complex interdependent systems becomes a challenge as well. And also, if information is provided regularly, can we build really incremental learning models for this generation of digital twin without requiring full retraining? And finally, we need to think how to incorporate these causal ideas to estimate, but also generate the effect of specific interventions. That being said, I really believe that digital twin technology is just emerging, if you like, as a discipline. I think it has a tremendous impact on the world. And I do think that as the machine learning community, and I want to reach out to you in Inspiration Exchange, our community, to really help us think hard about this technology that's emerging, and I think is very exciting for the world, but also challenging and complex and a new field in machine learning. Thank you.
So building on that sort of great introduction from Mihaela, I think we're going to be presenting this work, which was done jointly by Sam and myself, and supervised by Mihaela. And what we will be presenting today will address some of the challenges that Mihaela highlighted and some of the applications. And the title of this work is about automatically learning hybrid digital twins of dynamical systems. And we'll sort of see shortly what that's about. Cool. So just a quick recap and sort of contextualize everything. So we aim to model dynamical systems in this work. And so dynamical systems are just models or variables that evolve over time. And they're very useful to predict disease progression, evaluate treatment strategies, and improve patient care. And here I've given a few examples from epidemiology, PKPD models, and tumor growth models. And these are all examples of dynamical systems. And just a little bit of notation, because these will come in useful later for exposition. So we define a dynamical system as just a tuple containing a state space and an action space and some sort of dynamics function, which determines how state will evolve given some sort of action applied to it. So a digital twin, again, this is a little bit of recap, is a computational model that approximates the dynamical system. And here we introduce two subscripts to decorate F, and theta is the model specification, and omega of theta is the model parameterization. So what the specification is sort of just the functional form and the structure of the model that you use to approximate a dynamical system. And the parameterization are just the coefficients and the weights of a neural network, for example, that are learned to improve the digital twin. And yeah, a good digital twin will help us answer a few questions like simulating future outcomes, understanding system changes, and evaluating different intervention policies. And Mihaela mentioned 10 sort of core challenges, and here we're focusing on a few of them. And the first that we care about is generalization. And the fact that by design, digital twins are designed to operate on unseen situations. So it is, compared to traditional machine learning modeling, it is very important that we can robustly predict on-state action distributions that are not observed during training. And this is another one of the challenges that was already touched on, data scarcity. In most real-world systems, we have very few empirical observation of what's actually going on. So we need to be able to learn very accurate dynamics given limited empirical observations. And the next point is about evolvability. And I believe Mihaela referred to this as continuous updating or continuous model development. So this is the idea that when the real-world system that the model is modeling changes, for example, the epidemiology might change because the virus has mutated or different vaccination coverages, we want to be able to evolve the twin itself so that it still accurately captures how the system is behaving. And a brief overview of what people have, how existing works have approached the problem of building digital twins. So we can largely categorize them into one of two approaches. So mechanistic models are somewhat the classical approach. They're based on closed form equations, and these are basically grounded in some sort of biological physical principle. Like here, we have the very well-known SIR model. And the good thing about them is they're very generalizable and they're very interpretable. But that is only when they're correctly specified. And when that is not the case, for example, in settings when you have very limited understanding of the system at hand, these models can be a bit more limited. Neural network approaches, on the other hand, don't actually assume that much knowledge of the system being modeled. It just uses a black box or a neural network model to approximate the dynamics directly. And it can learn very complex patterns that is very difficult to specify mechanistically. The weaknesses, however, is that you need sufficient data, as in sufficient coverage of all the situations that you will be interested in to be able to learn this effectively. And because they're over-parameterized and monolithic, it's very difficult to update these models to reflect the changes in the underlying system. So a very promising approach to address this problem is that we can combine the mechanistic and the neural components together and to create what we call hybrid digital twins. So the hybrid digital twin is just a composition of a mechanistic model and a neural model, where the mechanistic model symbolically encodes some sort of domain-grounded priors, and this helps in improving the generalization of the model. And the neural model is the goal of this part is to learn the more complex patterns in regions where the mechanistic model might not be correct. And despite the promises of this, they're relatively underutilized because they rely heavily on human expertise to craft these hybrid models. So the aim of our work is whether we can come up with a way to automatically specify and parameterize these hybrid models with very limited human involvement. Cool. So before we jump into how the method actually works, we sort of also want to formulate the problem a little bit. So conceptually, building a hybrid model can be seen as involving two stages. The first stage is involving the specification of the model structure. In this case, the neural architecture or the functional form. And this is where the notation comes back in. So here, again, that's denoted by theta. And also about the parameterization. So learning the weights and coefficients of the hybrid model, which correspondingly is omega of theta. And here we denote it as a function of the specification, because for each specification, there's a corresponding set of possible parameterizations. And the process of automatically formulating a hybrid model following this sort of conceptual approach, you can sort of mathematically is like a bi-level optimization problem, where on the outer level, you have the task of finding the optimal specification, theta star, that minimizes or maximizes some sort of outer level loss. And the inner level objective is about finding the optimal parameterization corresponding to each specification. And to be a bit more concrete here, the outer level objective is basically the generalization performance, and the inner level objective is the training set performance. And automatically learning a hybrid twin sounds pretty promising, but it's actually not that straightforward when you dive a bit deeper. And there are two main challenges. So the first is like, how do you automatically encode the correct domain knowledge into these hybrid digital twins that are crucial to improve generalization and sample efficiency, and doing this in a way that makes sense, that is both consistent with what's understood in the domain, but also improves performance. So that's one of the challenges. The other challenge is about coming up with this optimal model. So in the previous sort of bi-level formulation, the outer level objective is a sort of combinatorial search space. And you can sort of think of it as a huge space at discrete and combinatorial of different possible models. And it is intractable to manually specify and optimize through more traditional means. Cool. So that sort of brings us finally to our method. What we try to do in this work is we try to use large language models in an evolutionary framework to efficiently design hybrid digital twins, given some instructions from the human expert. And there are three main components. We utilize the LLM as a very specialized tool to help us iteratively propose specifications for novel digital twins. And these specifications are represented symbolically in code. And we couple this with offline optimization tools to estimate the optimal parameters given some training data that is also provided to the algorithm. And lastly, we evaluate the performance both quantitatively. So this is evaluating the generalization performance on some sort of held out data set. And also qualitatively, where, for example, we can ask the LLM to evaluate the proposed model based on some requirements specified by the human expert. And we'll see sort of how these things play out. And this process, these three steps, is iterated on multiple times until we have a model that satisfies our criteria or achieves some sort of performance threshold. Cool. So this is a high-level visual review of what the method is doing. It is very involved, but it is fairly straightforward. And we'll be stepping through all of the steps one by one. And this whole, the algorithm starts with the expert involvement. So the expert initializes the entire process by initiating it with a modeling context. So the modeling context here is just a semantic description of the system, the metrics, and the requirements. So for example, you can be modeling an epidemiological system. You can describe the variables that you have, the requirements, and whatever metric you're evaluating your model on. And also some data that is split into a training and validation set is provided. And the first part of the algorithm is the model generation or the model proposal step. So in each generation, the modeling agent, which is here an LLM, it takes in the past models that have been generated, the context that is provided by the human user, and some sort of feedback that is generated to produce a novel specification. So when the specification is produced, it is basically sort of a structure or how a hybrid model should be constructed. But the parameters itself are placeholder parameters. And what we do is we sort of then use an offline optimizer, such as stochastic gradient descent, but it could be any sort of optimizer to find the parameters for the corresponding model. And then this whole step will give us a new model that's been parameterized and optimized. And the second step is, the third step is an evaluation and selection step. So all the newly generated models are evaluated using the provided modeling objective. For example, if you're interested in a mean squared error, we will compute the average validation loss of the entire model, as well as a component-wise validation loss. And here, each component is just one state variable. So this is sort of breaking down the performance by sort of the state variables that you have. And once that's done, we have a selection step. And what this essentially does is it compares this new model and how it has been evaluated quantitatively with all the past models that have been proposed. And you select the best ones based on some sort of selection criteria. So here we, for example, use top K, which is just a very simple mechanism that retains the top K best performing models as evaluated on the validation set. And the final step is a model improvement step. And this is probably one of the most critical steps. And here it is also performed by an evaluation agent. And what this evaluation does is it is actually evaluating the more qualitative requirements aspect of it. So for example, does something make sense from a physiological perspective? So this is very hard to do using like traditional metrics or evaluation procedures. But here we're using an LLM to be able to reason about these things based on its understanding or world knowledge. And after evaluating these models with respect to the requirements, it then generates some sort of very targeted suggestions for feedback, for model improvement. And this model improvement is fed back, and the cycle repeats. And each iteration, we have a new model, and we see that over time, it generates better and better models. And at this point, I'll hand off to Sam, who will walk us through some of the empirical investigations that we did.
Great, thank you so much, Tennison. So building on that, we empirically verified it extensively in the main paper and also the appendix. So one of the first points is observability. So we have this concept of generating these digital twins, we train them on data, and we really want to we require the approach of the LLM being able to understand the models once they've been optimized and actually evolve them and improve them over time. And we can see exactly this in the corresponding chart here. So what this allows us to do, representing the model in this case as code, which we then have black box neural network parameters or white box neural network parameters, we can then optimize to a data set and continually iterate this. The LLM still has the ability to understand in a way, the different architectures of this model. And what we see by actually representing the top K models, we can actually evolve almost like a Pareto front of the models over generation steps, as we can see here. And this is a typical, very similar evolutionary strategy, top K, or in this case, top 1 model evolve over time. What's interesting is we can actually see it evolving the models and actually incorporating feedback. So at each step, when we generate a model, the LM is also instructed to generate a short description of what the model is actually containing and why it's generated it. And we can see this plotted here in this chart figure. So initially, the LLM actually generates white box models. So for simple models, no neural network black box opaque parameters, which it then fits to the validation data set. And you can see here the validation data set decreases over time as it actually updates this fully interpretable, biologically plausible white box model. In this case, adding more complex terms, initially starting with linear model, and then actually adding biologically plausible terms. At such a point, it can't actually improve the model anymore. It starts adding multi-layered perceptron terms to actually capture the unmodeled residuals. And this actually, as we see, actually improves the performance and reduces the validation mean squared error up to about iteration 4. And continuing on this, we can then actually, the LLM can actually explore different models, as we see here. When it generates a new model, it can generate sometimes worse fitting models, but because we have this top K buffer of top models, we can use the best fitted model so far on the validation data set until it actually significantly improves the model fit. As we can see here, around iteration 12, it's managed to actually find a more complex model by using more complex white box functions to model the neural network. Next slide, please. So what's really nice actually with this ability to have the LLM understand the model and interpret it, in this case as code with functional parameters as well, we can do interesting things. Like one of the ability that is embedded with this is to apply an intervention. So we can take an existing model, in this case a COVID model, and we can actually ask the LLM to change a particular parameter, which can actually change how the dynamics of the model will evolve over time. So one key thing here is in COVID, certain intervention policies had never been tested before. We can actually ask the LLM to modify the model to simulate a certain intervention. And this is what this red line is at that point. And then we're forward simulating the model. And normally a typical neural network, which is just fitted to data, is unable to take such a radical intervention or simulation going forwards. It would just really fit to the existing data points that it's seen, hence continuing almost a linear line, whereas such a model can actually drastically take in a forward simulation of what might happen in this case. and which is similar to actually what the data shows, which is quite nice property. Next slide, please. And another really nice thing is we can also achieve a good simulation accuracy in distribution. And we compare against a number of competitive baselines, such as you may have heard of transformer models for sequential modeling, recurrent neural networks, and then also discovery methods like sparse identification nonlinear dynamic models, and also like a neural network or neural OD model for taking actions as well, which is also represented as dynode. What we see is our hybrid digital twin can actually model with a low validation mean squared error. Specifically, we also compare the ablations here of zero shot, where the LLM just outputs a model, and also zero shot optimized, where the LLM outputs a model, and then we optimize the parameters. And really leverages and shows actually this multiple step approach and gives us a better overall model to fit to the data set we have. Next slide, please. What's really nice as well, we looked at actually how these models generalize out of distribution. So obviously we know that typical machine learning methods do very well within distribution. That means we have a large data set and we're collecting samples or features within or similar to the features that we've seen before throughout training. However, what's nice is if we have a simple interpretive model, one of the key properties that comes from the symbolic regression literature is that actually such an equation or functional form, if we correctly identify it, generalizes very well to our distribution situations. And we see exactly this here. So what's nice is, in this case, we took a lung cancer simulation and we created sample data sets, one which was significantly out of distribution compared to the training data set. And we see actually if we can correctly uncover the correct underlying model and form and train such a model on it, in this case, our digital twin model here, we can then actually achieve a low validation mean squared error compared to neural network-based approaches or certain discovery methods which struggle to generalize to new out of distribution data. Next slide, please. One important thing as well is, given this, using the LLM's ability and knowledge of what might be plausible or biologically plausible, if we can correctly somewhat uncover some of the underlying structure, we can actually perform sample efficient learning as well. And this is really enabled by representing this functional form, which is quite sample efficient. Because if we can have some sort of correct functional form with a few important parameters or even biological plausible parameters, which can then refine to a data set we collected, then it can generalize well, but also we can learn these small number of parameters from a small amount of data set. So we're talking roughly maybe 10 parameters up to maybe a couple hundred parameters compared to maybe a neural network approach, such as a transformer, which may have millions of parameters, which would require a lot of data to fit, which is really actually quite nice here. And we see our method achieving good performance with less data in this spot. Next one, please. Yeah, so in summary, hybrid digital models are promising approaches to modeling systems with partial domain knowledge and limited empirical observations. We, Tennison and I and Mihaela, introduced the first method to automatically specify and optimize hybrid digital twins with limited human expert input. HD Twin Gen is a novel evolutionary algorithm using LLMs to efficiently propose, optimize, and iteratively enhance hybrid digital twins. Empirically, we can evolve hybrid digital twins to exhibit enhanced generalization, improved sample efficiency, and modular evolvability. And we'll look at future works. We also encourage future works to investigate expert-in-the-loop collaborative framework, advanced compositions, and uncertainty quantification. And you can also read more and see the paper link here. And we encourage you to check out the paper through the link. We have additional plots, interpretative plots, and a very extensive appendix with many different ablation experiments. Thank you. We also like to say huge thanks to our sponsors, the Cambridge Centre for AI and Medicine, AstraZeneca, and GSK.
So now onto our panel discussion, and I'm super pleased today to introduce our 4 amazing panelists. I think we're very fortunate to have 4 great panelists who are experts in their various domains. So let me introduce them. The first is Dr. Jim Weatherall. So he's the Vice President of Data Science and AI at AstraZeneca. Then we've been joined by Dr. Thomas Klabunde, who is the Global Head of Translational Disease Modeling at Sanofi. Then Dr. Jeremy Voisey, who is the senior scientist and team lead of AI research at Canon Medical Research. And then finally, Dr. Seidel, who's a principal methodology statistician at Global Biostatistics and Data Sciences at Boehringer-Ingelheim. So we're super fortunate to be joined by all of these 4 leading industry guests, and we're super excited for the panel discussion with them. And with that, I'll hand over to Mihaela to lead the discussion.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to start this panel by asking each one of you the following question. What do you think you can do with the digital twin that you could not do before? Why would you want to build digital twins for? And maybe I start with you, Jeremy, since I couldn't find you on the screen.
Oh, okay. Great, Chris. Thanks very much for inviting me along to your 40th edition of Inspiration Exchange, and thanks very much for the presentations. I think it's just cutting the edge of what we could do with digital twins. I won't take all the examples, but there are, from our point of view, could start with scanners, the digital twin of the scanner itself. But let's go on from that. I'm just going to pick up one, maybe a chronic disease. Imagine you've got a patient who's sadly developing Alzheimer's. I think there's something you could actually model the disease itself. You could use the wearable information to actually start to monitor that. And as you said, the difference is you're asking what interventions, what changes could I make to that patient to actually help them to moderate that, hopefully reduce that in some way. Quite a few different applications I can think of.
Thank you, Jeremy. Jan, can I pick on you next?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a very good question, I have to say. I think digital twins can help us bridging the gap between a lot of different functions, and also particularly those functions that are maybe not data scientists, right? Because we have a huge flexibility in digital twins, but it is also, I would say, not as abstract as a lot of different AI and machine learning algorithms and modeling approaches that we're usually working on. So it's actually relatively easy to create realistic expectations, what we can do and what we should do, right? And here it's also, I think, very helpful that due to this flexibility, we can not only use this for very, very complex additional approaches. So just one example, maybe as a echo to Jeremy's, using digital twins in clinical trials, right? So we can use basically these artificial patients in the control group, for example, or in a standard of care arm. And we can put more real patients in the active treatment arm, what usually is highly welcomed by the patients. But we can also, in that sense, as a company, reduce the recruitment time and also actually the amount of patients that we really need to recruit while keeping the power constant. And on top of that, we can relatively easily actually argue why this totally makes sense, right? So I think this is a very, very great point, not only for pharma, but particularly also for the patients.
Oh, so interesting. Thank you, Anne. Thomas.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me here. So at Sanofi, I mean, we built virtual patients as digital twins of the patients we have in the clinic using quantitative systems pharmacology modeling. And actually, this really integrates a lot of knowledge, a lot of data into the digital twins we have. And actually, we use them really to explore the clinical efficacy of novel drug candidates first in these virtual patients before we take them into the clinic or into the next clinical stage. So it's really helping our decision making, helping also getting medicines faster to the patients. And sometimes we're also able to replace clinical trials or the need for clinical trials, or at least reduce the number of patients we have then through clinical trials. So it's really accelerating things. And it's, I think, going beyond what you can do with more traditional PK/PD modeling, because you also can do it by definition for novel treatment approaches. Like if you have a novel mechanism that hasn't been explored, where you don't have data, that's where then the digital twins come into the game.
Thank you. Jim.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll now try and pick a different example, because these are all great, but let me try and take it in even further. I think one day we need to move to a world where this is happening for like sort of real healthcare decisions for all of us, right? I think, if each of us was digitally twinned, some people call it a health avatar, and our health avatar is kind of exploring all these different pathways for us through the healthcare system. I mean, it might advise whether we should participate in a clinical trial, or it might advise that we go onto a particular treatment pathway. That seems incredibly powerful to me. So I love the examples around twinning trials, twinning patients. And wouldn't it be great if we could take that further, so that sort of everybody's healthcare is essentially twinned, hopefully in a not just a safe way, but in a way that's so data driven that it goes way beyond the care of today. So I almost think that the digital twins could be potentially driving both medical research and clinical practice in the future. I think that'd be really exciting.
And maybe healthcare systems, Jim.
Yeah, perhaps, you know, twinning, and I love the bit in your introduction, Mihaela, that was sort of about, you know, you could twin sort of biological systems, humans, populations, you know, so we can think about the sort of Russian doll sequence of twinning as well. There's almost no limits.
Thank you all very much. I'm going now to another question, and I want to ask each one of you to choose two, no more than two, and maybe in this way, each one of you chooses something different, hopefully. Two requirements that you want to have from these digital twins. So if it is to build digital twins, what would be the requirements that you would put on this design to make them successful? And one that I want to put on the table, maybe one of them picks it or doesn't, is how much interpretability we need as part of this. So maybe, I don't know, I start with you, Thomas, and then I go to the rest.
Yeah, happy to start. And I think probably people have different perspectives on this. I mean, coming from the QSP world, quantitative systems pharmacology modeling, I'm always promoting the approach we take without saying there are no others. It really needs to provide a causal connection between all the underlying processes, so that you can really, well, talk to a clinician, talk to the project team, in the end, maybe also talk to the regulatory authorities, explaining how the simulation results builds up from binding to the target receptor up to the clinical endpoint. So I think really this causal connection between the underlying processes for me is a must. And the second I would say is also it needs to model the dynamic response, not only single time points, so that you really have then the time series prediction for the different well, at the different level, at the cellular level, at the organ level, and also then in the end at the human level. But I mean, with that being said, I mean, and I think Mihaela, you showed it well in your introduction. I mean, obviously this is the knowledge we capture, but there are some areas where we don't have enough knowledge that can help us building a twin. So we have to mix in other approaches that really are more generating a model just based on the data we have. And I think that's why I like this hybrid approach, where you combine knowledge with well, just data modeling. So as I said, I think for me it's causality and also modeling the dynamic response, but I see also opportunities in other areas.
Sure. So let's hear about these other areas. So Jan.
Yeah. For me, I think interpretability is an important part. I would, however, rather call it maybe evaluative trustworthiness. And maybe I start at this point, coming to my second point afterwards. I would say I'm very pragmatic here. So the real answer, and totally not useful answer, is it really depends. So full stop, right? So it really depends on the question we want to answer, the concept that you actually want to have. And based on that, the question of interpretability will raise. And I don't think that we need 100% interpretability. We need utility, right? And I think this is a very important point. But this is based on the initial research question, the initial intention, and also, of course, on the data that we're having, right? And this maybe leads to my second pillar. And I think this is the possibility of extrapolating. Because I think we heard already, for example, the example of Alzheimer's patients. There's a lot of historical data of Alzheimer's patients. But I really have to think through this very, very at the beginning, if I can actually use these kind of patients to shape this in a way that I really get a twin that is really representative of my own patient data, for example, if we are staying in the realm of patient. And maybe if you're not having, for example, Alzheimer's patients, where we have a very long, very stable or no development at all, right? In a medical historical perspective, there's not so much change in this field regarding medicine and so on and treatment. But if you're thinking about oncology, for example, I cannot usually not use historical data that is, let's say, older than 2 years, because within 2 years in oncology, there's so much development, there's so many things going on. So my patients that are maybe 5 years or even 3 years old, or these kind of data collected 3 years ago, they are just not representative anymore, right? And we really have to think about how we can incorporate this into our digital twin models, because otherwise, coming back to the first point, it's just not useful for us.
Wow, I didn't even think about this. Very interesting. Jim.
Yeah, I suspect our requirements are going to start to overlap in our terminology, but I'll give you two, agency and actionability. So by actionability, I mean, so I'm going to continue the theme that I had before, right? Let's say we've got a digital twin of a real person that's exploring a healthcare system. I do want that twin to come back with healthcare decisions that I can actually action, right? It sounds obvious, but I'm sure it's also easy to come up with many plans and lifestyle changes and medication changes that are simply not feasible for some reason. So rooted in actionability, so maybe there's a set of constraints there. And then I think my nice to have, so that's my core requirement. My nice to have requirement is the agency. So what I mean by that is, to the degree that a digital twin is like a semi-autonomous agent. So again, imagine my digital twin moving through a healthcare system and testing out different pathways. It's more than just a scientific system that responds to a stimulus, right? We know that humans are to a degree irrational, and what might for me be quality of life in terms of health and well-being and living might be different for me, might be different for everybody else on this call, and it might not be rational. So if we can find some way, that sounds like a bit of a stretch, but if we can find some way of modeling the humanness into our twins, or perhaps conditioning them with, I mean, maybe what I like to do is go on 6 foreign holidays a year. So if that's my constraint, can you optimize my lifestyle and my health to allow me to do that? So adding that humanness in would be awesome as well.
And Jim, maybe on this point, again, this difference on one hand from the digital twinning, which is more this generation aspect and given interventions, the generation, versus on the other hand, making these decisions and making these recommendations. So I guess the recommendations could be done independent of the digital twin. But then what you are saying is that this is somewhat endogenous, that because the individual has his own preferences, that makes for the digital twin to really behave differently also. This is what you are saying, if I understand correctly.
I think so. And for me, it's really hard to think about generative twinning without also thinking about the actionability of what I do with those scenarios as well. So you're right, I'm conflating those two things because it's really hard for me to separate them.
That's an interesting discussion in its own right, I think. Thank you for that. Jeremy.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm going to, as Jim said, we'll start to overlap a wee bit, but I think spinning off from that is just the idea that the model, the digital twin, is really updating for me personally. So that kind of, if I go to a doctor, or if I access my digital twin in some way, and I've made a prediction, and then kind of maybe a few months later, then I would want to make sure the digital twin, when it makes another update, is taking into account what's happened to me in the meantime. It's not just this goes back to the question: what's the difference between an AI model and a digital twin? An AI model, it's the same model being applied to every single individual, and you're going to keep on applying it to me over and over again. But I want the digital twin to update its predictions based on the historical data it's seen from me individually. And the second thing, I'll go for a bit more meta, is I want it to be accessible to me. So I would like the ability to be able to kind of log on to a portal somewhere where I can see Jeremy's digital twin and I can interrogate it myself. It's my patient data. I would like to see it, please.
This is really very thought-provoking as well. Thank you very much, all of you. This is really wonderful. In view of time, since the people in the audience may want to put you questions, could I finalize with just very, very quick, what type of data would you like to use for this, for building a digital twin? Maybe just 1 minute from each of you, and then I give it back to Nabil to ask questions. So Jeremy, since you are now, what type of data would you like to use? And then maybe I'll ask our other panelists what they think, and just very brief.
Okay, well, given I work for Canon Medical, I'm going to have to say imaging data. I'm interested to see the relationship, how that comes into it as well. But kind of, I'm going to give space to my kind of co-panelists to add in the other types of data, which will also be useful. But yeah, I would be interested to see. For example, I mentioned Alzheimer's there, so that's going to make a difference with the MRI. You would expect to see changes, and how that would be used to actually influence then kind of your predictions in the future.
Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally we use data from clinical trials to inform our digital twins. But I mean, the question is then, how deep is the profiling of the patient in the clinical trial? So is it just on the surface, like, I mean, any kind of biomarker, proteomics, or clinical endpoints? Or do we, for example, have transcriptomics data at the single cell level? So I think we are currently really eager to integrate single cell NGS into our digital twins to really have a deeply profiled patient here.
Jim?
Okay, I would say me and my environment. So everything that I do, my habits, my movements, my, as much as we can capture what I eat, how I exercise, I think I need to be understood if I'm going to be twinned. And then also my environment, what do I interact in? What's the pollen count today? What's the weather like? What's the traffic like? What's the air pollution? I think all of that helps to understand how somebody is going to have a good day or a bad day.
Thank you. Jan?
I would say as many as possible and as little as necessary. And I would also like to extend what has been mentioned already. Yeah, clinical and also real-world evidence data, of course, is very important. But I actually would say I wouldn't mind if it's tabular, if it's unstructured data, as for example sound or images or any kind of wavelengths. I would like to extend this to the area of so-called digital biomarkers or digital traits, right? Because I think this is a huge field where really digital twins can be incredibly helpful, right? We can collect so much data with our phone or our smartwatch alone within milliseconds. We can use this, we can utilize this, and we can actually try to make sense out of this. But for this, we really need very sophisticated algorithms. And I think digital twins really can also bridge this gap between our human limited way of abstract thinking in that sense, and actually making really something out of a lot of chaos, where then these algorithms come into play. So I think this is also a huge part of the future that we will see. And I think it's very much also connected, Jim, what you just said about everything should actually be included for me to be a proper twin.
Thank you so much, all of you, for this fascinating discussion. Nabil, sorry to be a little, we all got excited in our presentations, especially, and we didn't left enough time as always, but back to you.
Thanks so much for the great panel. And I guess in the essence of time, so we do have many questions in the chat, and I think we'll let the speakers from the lab answer the questions in the chat. And while we have our 4 panelists here, I think we'll go to the questions specifically targeted to our panelists, if that's okay with our audience. So the first question that we have for the panelists is from Harry, if you'd like to unmute.
Thanks, Nabil. This is a general question for any of the panelists, and I was wondering about the verification or evaluation piece of the digital twins, and what are the most important dimensions to verify along? Obviously, there's data-driven verification on the historical data from the patient themselves or other patients with similar characteristics, and then the simulations could be assessed for medical accuracy based on general medical knowledge, but are there any other important dimensions that the simulation should obey or be assessed along?
Maybe
Yeah, maybe I can throw in one more, and then other panelists might want to add on. I think if we're I'll go from some of the more expansive use cases we were talking about before and just get to a really specific one now. I think some of the other panelists were talking about, you know, efficacy of medicines and things like that. I think in those kind of cases, I'd want some assurance, and I'm thinking out loud how to do this, so I don't quite know the answer, but some assurance that the twins would have a good notion of kind of relative and individual treatment effect. So if we think about how we do twinning today, and we sort of do simulations of what if the patient took this medicine, what if the patient does that medicine, and what's the difference in outcomes between those two, I wonder if that's something we can sort of put constraints or guarantees on that would verify the validity of any digital twin generating process that would at least give me something that could replicate maybe differential treatment effects that we'd seen before. That's one thought. Other panelists may have other examples.
Yeah, maybe I can add to this. Good question, Harry. So, I mean, for us, I mean, obviously there are methods to say, okay, I take away a little bit data for the training, and then, saying, okay, I now have a scenario where I'm only using data that the model hasn't seen yet to make a prediction. I think it's always for us difficult to convince our stakeholders that we didn't cheat here, to be honest. So for us, it's really a prediction of the treatment effect of a trial that comes out after we have made the prediction. So really saying we make a prediction, we put it in a bucket, then the trial result comes, and then we can compare, was the prediction right on the trial? Then we say we have trust in the model and apply it for the future decision making. That's our approach.
Yeah, I think extending that to the trial itself, the trial would be perhaps the digital twin itself. If you have a digital twin, which is perhaps lifestyle changes, you might want a trial actually of the digital twin technology where people are actually using a digital twin to guide them through a kind of a chronic condition, and those who don't.
Yep. Maybe one additional dimension is actually the stakeholders. Not sure, Thomas, if you said it before. You can create the most perfect model. Let's assume it's almost 100% in any kind of metric. If you cannot sell this to the stakeholders that make the decision, it will not fly. And depending on who the stakeholders are, and depending on the research question and actually the output that you want to create with your modeling approach, interpretability, transparency might actually be very much overestimated by them compared to you. And you need to find a compromise. And ideally, this is something that has been or will be discussed already in the beginning. What actually would be a good trade-off between very good performance, but 100% black box model, for example, or in between something, and also what would be a good cutoff, right? Because usually we don't get, I don't know, 99% or almost perfect metrics in that regard. So what would actually convince the stakeholders? And this is something besides actually thinking about prospective testing of the model itself. This should also be done in a preparatory approach, right? Before you even start with the modeling, this should be already been discussed.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jan. And then I think just in the essence of time, I'll summarize our last two questions for the panelists and kind of put them together. So Raghavendra and Eliza, apologies if I do miss bits of it, trying to condense it. So effectively, the question was to all the panelists is, when you're thinking of building a digital twin in any of your environments, how do you think about injecting novel information, such as like a novel drug, into the digital twin? And related to injecting this information, how might there be some of these like security considerations if it's, say, for example, patient level data? How do you think about both these sorts of ideas of injecting novel information, but then also there's like the security aspect around it? And I guess whoever wants to take it.
Yeah, maybe I can start. So obviously, I mean, the twins we built here, they are updated with new data we get. So definitely, if we have new clinical trial data from a new treatment, we include it to update, to parameterize, also to well, train, especially the pharmacology for that pathway. And I mean, obviously, there's always issue on data privacy. So typically we then use anonymized data that is accessible then for secondary use if it's stated in the informed consent form of the patient. So there's something you have to definitely you have to respect, like data privacy of the patient, but we try to include as much information as possible and update our twins.
Yeah, and very similar approach here to Thomas. So maybe I'll just add rather than repeat. So we would also take care around the identification, anonymization, aggregation, that kind of thing, but also other lines of defense, so to speak, as well, against privacy breaches, such as, you know, usual cybersecurity, the usual kind of documentation and training for employees to make sure they understand their responsibilities with the data. It's sometimes easy to forget these things, but those traditional practices are still very valid in today's world. With the injection of new information, I mean, the only real, I suppose, sensitivity I can think of there, you know, if it's an experimental new medicine that is the commercial confidential information that belongs to that company, then sometimes it can become a little sensitive, right? And then we would just be careful to, I'm sure any company would be careful to sort of firewall how we do those twin simulations and those sort of generative experiments. And again, that would be no different to how we use proprietary information today. So again, just the usual safeguards. We're either trying to protect a company's assets, or we're trying to protect a patient's ID, and they're both really, really important things.
I think it was Jan who mentioned about the stakeholders, and the other side of that as well is that if we can encourage the stakeholders that this is something that will be beneficial to them, I think we need to do perhaps a better job of actually doing that in the machine learning community. Perhaps they're saying to actually, people will be more willing for their data to be shared. They understand that this is ultimately intending to help them. That we encourage them to do that. And going back to the digital idea of the digital passports, the health secretary has recently mentioned the idea of digital passports, that people make their data, they will be accessible to them. I would love to have the ability myself to say, you know, I'm quite happy for my data to be used anonymized for healthcare research, and give that within myself.
Also, maybe add to every great point that has been taken so far. Mihaela, I think you mentioned this in the intro talk. We also have the possibilities to enhance our digital twin data with synthetic data, right? We can even think about a hybrid approach where we basically combine synthetic data with our a priori knowledge that of the assumed coefficients and parameters, right? So we can basically combine synthetic data and simulation approaches in that sense, and then put this data into our digital twin approach as well, right? So if we actually have this problems that we cannot circumvent, for example, data breach considerations and so on, then this might be again a pragmatic approach that we at least can asymptotically reach also this additional information into the digital twins.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jan, and thanks so much, everyone, for this. I think in the essence of time, I really just want to thank Jim, Thomas, Jeremy, and Jan for this really insightful panel discussion. I think there were super interesting ideas being floated around from everyone, and hopefully this spurs more interesting ideas for everyone on the call. And I just want to thank them all for taking the time to join us and for having such a great discussion.